Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The nation, the Democratic Party, the progressive movement, all getting ready for a new administration and a new Congress in January. And we are looking forward to 2021 this week. Joining us now is Mary Small, Legislative Director of Indivisible. I imagine most of you know about Indivisible. If you don't, you certainly should. It's indivisible.org, a great grassroots progressive voting and progressive action organization. Of course, Mary, if I've done it injustice in my description, correct me, but without any further ado, let's start talking about Congress and what's going to happen next year. So Mary Small, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Did I leave out anything important about Indivisible?
I thought that was a great summary of what we're about and what we're aiming to do.
Great, good. So let's talk about the House. Here we are. We are at the brink of an unknown new political moment. We have Joe Biden and Kamala Harris coming in to the new administration. We have the Senate outcome uncertain. And when it comes to the House of Representatives, to me anyway, and feel free to, offer a different perspective, to me, the challenge that Democrats have to face and the progressives have to lead them in facing is the magnitude of the many problems before us, starting with the pandemic, but runaway inequality, climate change, military engagement around the world, the list is long, corporate dominance, et cetera, the erosion of democracy, huge agenda. And the one, as of now, clear outcome, Democrats have the House, but you guys have been working on what it would take to make the House, the way I'd put it, is a more effective engine of change. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, that is absolutely right. I mean, we are completely in alignment with sort of the intersecting crises that you just talked about, all of which are big and structural and require bold legislation and executive action to really address. I think, at Indivisible, we really hold ourselves to strong progressive values, but also smart strategy. We're about both of those things. So not just can we articulate the solutions that communities need to really address, again, the intersecting crises that you just laid out, but can we chart out a real viable strategy and pathway to actually make progress and beginning winning those things. And completely, that's part of where we look to the House, and specifically where we look to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the House. And I think we're going to get into this in just a little bit, but it's part of why we're so excited to see the Congressional Progressive Caucus beginning to really reshape themselves, remake themselves into a more effective legislating body.
Yeah, and let's start, why don't we, by talking about that. The co-chairs of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal and Mark Pocan, they're announcing, I think I know, but tell us.
Yeah, so there's several different pieces of the changes that they have made, everything from updating the progressive promise to changing their attendance policy. But the really meaty, juicy piece of it that we're so excited about is that they have given themselves an increased capacity to negotiate and vote as a bloc. Progressive activist group, grassroots activists, observers of Congress for a long time have called for this, have looked at the way that progressives have tried to control the agenda, push bills forward, make amendments to existing bills, be able to ask for and win changes, and have seen really a consolidation of power with Nancy Pelosi as Speaker and an inability to actually move their agenda in the House. And so there has been this diagnosis that what you need to do is negotiate and vote as a bloc, collectively wield that power in a way that refuses to let bills advance to the floor, advance through the Rules Committee, until you've had a chance to have your fair say. And that is exactly what the Congressional Progressive Caucus has voted to do. They voted to kind of more clearly set up a structure through which they can take collective positions, bind their votes together as a caucus, and be able to wield power in that really powerful way.
So Mary Small, one of the thoughts I had about this, and I was really happy to see it. I had two sets of thoughts, right? One was rhetorical and one was practical or pragmatic. The rhetorical one was I've started to get to the point where I stopped calling myself a progressive because I don't even know what it means. I mean, you get people saying I'm a progressive who gets things done, which usually means I'm a progressive who gets things done that aren't very progressive. It became like a signifier of something nice. And I think what happened to the CPC, which is an organization I love, this is not a knock, but I think there were a lot of people in it who weren't what you and I might think of as progressive. So getting the group to act in a coherent way was a challenge for its leadership. And so to me, it seems to me tactically that, and I'm sorry, I don't know the numbers, but a group of 100 members of Congress, let's say, that can't act in concert is less effective than a group of 65 or 75 people that can say, you get our votes by doing this, you don't get our votes by doing that. Is that kind of what we're looking at here?
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. Certainly there is powers in numbers, but if the number doesn't move together, it's actually a relatively weak mechanism, right? And so that's really what these reforms are oriented towards. That's what we understand they intend to use it for. And to your point about labels, like let's get down to the specifics of what we're talking about. We're talking about, for example, making prescription drugs affordable and accessible to everybody. I mean, I think one of the defining fights from this last year that really laid the groundwork for the Progressive Caucus to really remake themselves in this way was the fight over HR 3, which was the House's sort of banner prescription drug pricing bill. And what they ended up passing and moving forward to the floor was astonishingly weak for a Democratic bill that they didn't even have a mechanism to force movement on in the Senate. And even if they had, it would have gotten watered down further there. One of the key pieces of it was about how many drugs the government was going to be able to negotiate on to lower the prices of prescription drugs, a bipartisanly popular issue across the board. And they self-limited to 25 drugs. Absolutely no reason for that. And it really took the Progressive Caucus actually coming together in a very rare moment of collective negotiation and a threat of a collective vote to be able to force just a small sliver of an amendment to that. So I think that labels aside, it's really the underlying policy changes that people need to live well and thrive in their communities that we're talking about, and having a part of the House who has a mechanism to force changes on behalf of people all across the country is a really welcome change.
Yeah, and Mary Small, I'm sort of pondering as we talk, where to go at what time and all that. That's kind of this job. But one of the things that occurs to me in all of this that I think is so important is that conversations like this here in Washington, D.C., many times you get people reacting to what you and I are saying now by saying, well, the squad and the liberals, the lefties, and they don't know what it's like to try to build a majority in Congress. But we're talking by and large about policies that I am absolutely convinced, not based on instinct, but based on polling data, will help the Democrats grow and maintain a majority if they pursue them. The level you mentioned, the drug bill that was like kind of negotiated against itself into being pretty weak. If the Democrats came in the House, came out with a forceful drug bill that would really change people's finances, change people's health, change people's access to needed medications, that's not like something that just AOC's constituency cares about. That's something I know Lloyd Doggett's constituency in Texas cares about. Every Connor Lamb's constituency in Pennsylvania cares about. So we're not talking about using progressive power as an ego trip or in a way that will hurt the Democratic Party nationwide, in my view, but I want your thoughts. We're using it in ways that will help people and help the party. I assume you agree with that, but let me know.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, first, I would be remiss if I Representative Doggett's behalf that he was actually a leader in the fight on drug pricing. So credit where credit is due. I think that there's sort of two pieces of it. So on one hand, I think that you're right. so many of the policies that progressives are fighting for are actually wildly popular, and will change people's lives for the better if they're fully implemented, if they're able to like really take them forward and across the finish line. Completely agree with you there. But the other piece that I think is also critically important in this sort of like intra-party that we're seeing happen right now, is also that the play that the moderates are trying to run has failed repeatedly. So it's not just about better policies, it's also about better strategy.
Yeah.
And I think, in preparation for what the outcomes that might be coming out of this electoral cycle, our team did a really deep dive into what happened under the Obama administration when they had a trifecta, when there was a split Congress, these different scenarios. And one of the things that was a repeated strategic error on the part of Democrats was falling for a false offer of bipartisanship from Republicans, whose entire play was to string Democrats along with fake negotiations, to waste time, to use up political capital, to water down the ultimate policy solution that was being offered, and then not even vote for it in the end, right? And they ran that play on Democrats over and over. And every time they offered this fake offer of bipartisanship, well, I shouldn't say every time, but quite often, Democrats took the bait. And so I think part of what we're saying in this moment is, one, the policies that you want are actually very popular. And two, there's no point in running a play that has failed over and over and over again, and also didn't end up insulating you from right-wing attacks anyway. So I think it's both pieces: popular policies and being real about what strategies are actually effective and actually are going to work. And I think that that's, to take it back to this progressive voting bloc for a second, part of why I'm really excited about the way, that we are hearing members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the squad, but also other members of Congress talk about how they want to use this capability. I think sometimes there's a little bit of, a caricature thrown up about the resistance that wants to just vote no or vote down things. But every conversation that we are having is about how you use this capability to govern responsibly. Yes, at times they're going to use a voting block to vote down bills that are bad or harmful or are going to hurt people. But so much more often, they're going to use the voting block in order to force improvements, to give a fair shot at amendments that they want to offer on the floor. And that's the kind of responsible governing that's not just going to help progressives, but are going to help the entire Democratic Party wield power, govern responsibly, and actually push forward policies that will end up being popular with the electorate.
And again, we're talking with Mary Small, who is the legislative director of Indivisible at indivisible.org. So, Mary, that's a perfect time to pivot to, and this is on your website as well, House of Representatives rules that need changing. As you point out, each new Congress votes on a set of rules under which they will operate, and those rules have historically made it harder to pass progressive legislation. In general, I would say harder to pass popular legislation that, for one reason or another, there may be reasons why some people don't want passed. But, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But let's talk about that a little bit. You've listed two major barriers. The first is what's called the motion to recommit. What's that?
This is the kind of thing that it makes me giddy to talk about. So I'm very glad that you ask about it. So the motion to recommit is basically the ability, well, actually, before I get into that, let me just say, I think the big picture frame here is if you, like me, myself, Mary, is setting up the rules for a contest that I'm going to be in. Right. Why would I write my own rule that says Mary has to fight with one hand behind her back? Why would I write that rule for myself? And that's essentially what Democrats have often chosen to do. So these two examples that we're going to talk about, the MTR, the motion to recommit, is basically a mechanism through which the minority party, so in this case, Republicans, are able to sneak in a last minute amendment to a piece of legislation, often moments before it has to be voted on. And they've become commonly used as sort of gotcha votes for moderates, for frontliners, even for folks who aren't necessarily very moderate, because they're always politically charged, tricky, written in a gotcha kind of way. And it's basically just handing a gotcha moment to Republicans to either have Democrats take undemocratic votes, or to put them in a hard spot. The
Oh,
MTRs should be eliminated. There's no reason to keep them. They do not serve a legitimate governing purpose. They do not improve legislation. They're a political hit, and there's no reason for Democrats to tie one hand behind their back when it comes to putting MTRs into their rules package.
the it may I don't I'm curious now. You got me curious. Where did this rule come from? Because I don't know. I mean, was this just well, we won too big, so we want to damage our ability to do anything? I can't believe that's the logic. So, or at least overtly. So, what do you know? I mean, what's the history of this thing?
That's a good question, Richard. I don't actually know the history of it off the top of my head. If you talk to proponents of the MTR, they will tell you that its rightful function is to make sure that there's a chance to sort of amend legislation in good faith. And I can tell you for sure that for a long stretch now is not how it has been used, but it's a great question about the history. I don't know.
Well, if I give somebody the right to do something in good faith and over again they use it in bad faith, I should take it away. You know, it seems to me. Okay. And again, Mary Small, the other biggie that you guys mentioned, and by the way, I'm sure we could get into like how committees work and everything else too, but these are the two biggies. The other big rule that needs changing, and Mary, as someone who writes about economics a lot, this one is really a big deal. The pay-go rule. So tell us about that, if you would.
So if you were to take the politics of austerity and turn them into a procedural rule, this is basically what you would come up with. So the way that it works is it says that any legislation that spends money has to offset that somewhere else. They have to identify a pay for, is what they call it, some way to offset the additional money that you're spending. Unfortunately, what that does is incentivize legislators who are writing legislation, rather than focusing on good policy, focusing on the big picture, what communities actually need, how we have an overall system that actually works for everybody. It incentivizes legislators to fixate on either how they're going to pay for the policy, or worse, to write incremental legislation that doesn't actually address the underlying problem that they're trying to talk about, because they're worried about the cost associated with it. When in fact, we know, especially as progressives, that oftentimes investments in communities
Right.
actually pay for themselves many times over if you make the upfront investment. And this is a sort of a procedural rule in the House that disincentivizes real problem solving and instead pushes members of Congress towards band-aid solutions that don't really work.
And Republicans are notoriously indifferent to, you know, if they want to put out a $2 or $3 trillion tax break to billionaires and corporations, they don't look for a pay for, they just do it. And if George W. Bush wants to lie our way into a $3 trillion war, he just does it. So as the great British politician Anthony Wedgwood Benn once said, no general ever said, I'd like to bomb Baghdad, but I don't have the budget for it. So this is another kind of self-imposed rule that, as you say, doesn't recognize the concept of investment as a federal policy, doesn't recognize the dynamic nature of an economy as something that, you know, has multiple moving parts. So the pay-go rule, and, you know, I've talked to senior, you know, members of the Democratic Caucus on the Hill, and they all say, well, you know, we love to do the things you want, but, you know, pay-go rule, they treat it as if it is an act of God rather than something that they put in. So I guess the two big things we should be asking for are an end to this motion to recommit or whatever it's called, and the pay-go rule, which has been in my my crosshairs for a long time. And by the way, you don't have to be like a modern monetary theory person or whatever to believe that that's just like an overly defeating rule that creates an obstacle, almost always evoked exclusively for, maybe it's my perception, but for progressive legislation. So those are the two biggies. Anything else? I mean, is there any way to organize around the issues of getting rid of these two manacles on Congress?
Yes, absolutely. So the thing to know for your listeners is that the pay-go, motion to recommit, lots of other things are ultimately going to be rolled into what's called a rules package that has to be voted on just like a piece of legislation has to be voted on. And so there's going to be a vote. There's going to be a moment where your member of Congress is going to vote yes or no on whether or not this is the terrain that they want to choose to fight on. And to do their work on in the next year. Where we have already seen the Congressional Progressive Caucus come out with a letter opposing both of these. We're expecting to see more organizing activity in the days ahead. And then we'll ultimately have a vote. There'll ultimately be a moment where it makes sense for every single person listening to call their member of Congress and demand that they vote yes or no, depending on what ends up in that package, and support their member of Congress in organizing against PAYGO, against MTRs in the lead up to that vote.
So Mary Small, what's the timeline on that? When can we expect that rules package to be put together? Will it be available for the public to see? And when will we be? When would it be most effective for us to barrage our representatives about it?
No time like the present. It's a rules package for the next Congress that actually starts next year, but a lot of the groundwork is being laid right now. I would expect that you're going to see some movement from the Progressive Caucus in the days ahead, but it's literally not too early. You can call your member of Congress right now, say you just learned about PAYGO, you just learned about the motion to recommit, you think they're both terrible self-limiting rules that progressives should not constrain themselves by. You can do that today. And if you want sort of a more detailed step-by-step as the organizing around this coalesces, you can also keep an eye on indivisible.org.
Okay, and then before we go off the whole issue of congressional rules and process, Mary Small, and I should warn you, I'm a little bit of a nerd on this stuff too, but the other, there's a whole plethora of rules and traditions, procedures, and I mean, not every tradition is bad, of course, but one of the ones that comes to mind for me is the great power of committee chairs and how, for an organization that's supposed to represent democracy, there's a great deal of hierarchy and top-down power in Congress. And then there's a whole question of whether to what extent seniority should be the sole primary or even major determinant of committee leadership, all those things. Do you have thoughts on that? Does your org have thoughts on that and working on that, or any other issues we haven't talked about yet on the rules side of the House?
Yeah, there's several, you can really go down the rabbit hole on some of this, but certainly agree that the agenda setting power of committee chairs is tremendous, sort of can't be overstated in terms of determining what it's possible to move ahead. There's a few chairships that are going to be open. We'll be supporting some folks for those once that heats up. But overall, I think would just encourage your listeners to think about it in the same way that you might think about PAYGO or MTR, right? Like, how can we actually set up the rules of the game in a way that helps progressives wield power, helps them govern well, and that also provides kind of a pathway for new life and new ideas to actually cycle through the House.
And I would only add to that, Mary, that it's not, yes, it's pathways to power for progressives, but to me, it's it's a set of tools for increased transparency, increased debate, openness of debate. I think the rules, if there are moderates in the House who are in the Democratic side is included, I guess there aren't any moderate Republicans left, but if there are moderates in the House who so-called who want to make their case for their ideas, this gives them a chance to do so publicly too. And if you don't mind, again, we're talking with Mary Small, Legislative Director of Indivisible. You also have, on the issue of the Progressive Caucus, you have a page called Why We Need a Progressive Voting Bloc, and what it pivots to right away. And I think this is so important, both for elevating the internal debate within the Democratic Party, but also for people to just generally understand. There's a paragraph or section called Establishing the Difference Between Destructive and Constructive Disunity, because we've been hearing this mantra that I think the definition of disunity is when I have power and you don't agree with me, that's disunity. If you have power and I don't agree with you, that's democracy. I think that's the way that rule has been applied, which is with the thumb on the scale. But this is a really good section because it begins and I want to talk about it a little bit, but it is critical to differentiate between a destructive voting bloc, think Freedom Caucus, which grew out of the Tea Party, and a constructive voting bloc, which we are building. And then it says to prompt meaningful consultation and concessions. And another key sentence: the voting bloc should most often be used to improve legislation as opposed to killing it. We've been seeing a lot since the election of, conservative Democrats yelling at the left as opposed to meaningful engagement to determine what the best path forward is. That's been, even for me, a bit of a cynic, something of a disappointment. And I would like to think that this whole process is one of constructive disunity, which is, after all, what democracy is, right? Democracy, by definition, is people with different viewpoints, not unified viewpoints, coming together to work out their differences. Am I waxing too philosophical here, or what?
No, I appreciate that. But I also think this distinction between the progressive voting bloc and what we saw with the Freedom Caucus is important. So for your listeners who might not be familiar with the Freedom Caucus, this is a voting bloc on the right that came out of the Tea Party movement. And so it's a group of far-right legislators who negotiated and voted as a bloc, and who in a lot of ways had a bit of a burn it all down strategy. And in a Republican trifecta, ended up handing power to Democrats on spending bills, because they would never vote for their own party's spending bills, terrible as they were. And so Republicans had to go shop for Democratic votes in order to pass their own spending bills. And so they handed power to Democrats that Democrats otherwise wouldn't have had in a trifecta. And so I think when you start talking to people on the Hill about a voting bloc, they have a lot of, they have a lot of associations with the way that, yes, the Freedom Caucus was very successful in pulling the Republican Party right and hardening a lot of extremist GOP positions, and was also used in some ways to hurt their own party's negotiating power on specific bills. And so what we had to do was try to figure out how to articulate a different model, because at the end of the day, progressives have a different goal. They're actually not trying to burn down the federal government. They're trying to, yes, wield power and push for progressive policies, but also govern, also make the government actually work for communities all across the country. And so, that pathway is sort of what led us to this, which is, and I don't want to hide the ball or sugarcoat it. Sometimes the voting bloc should be used to kill bad legislation. Right. That should happen sometimes. Right. But most often, it's going to be used to improve it, to make it better, to make sure that pieces or communities or groups of people who were overlooked are actually included. And I think that, that's the definition of constructive disunity. That's the definition of how you wield power to actually govern by and for the people.
Sure. I think that's extremely well said. And Mary Small, I guess last topic, power. It seems to me that Democrats, liberals, a lot of progressives have had an uneasy relationship with the idea of assessing your own political power, building your political strength, and using it constructively. Maybe I'm off base about this, but it seems to me, one of the things I like about what you guys are doing, one of the things I like about what the Congressional Progressive Caucus is doing, is we're not out in the rain complaining about being mistreated. We're not afraid to say we know what the country needs. We know what we stand for. We're not afraid to strategize and articulate a path to power so that we can make effective change. To me, that seems new a little bit. Republicans have been ruthless about it. Centrists have been quite shrewd about it. It seems to me that there's a path forward psychologically, for lack of a better word, as well as politically. Does that make any sense to you at all?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. And, not to discredit individual progressives who have really been bold about wielding power and naming that need for a long time. But I think the way that we're seeing the Congressional Progressive Caucus come together and write into their own bylaws the ability to wield power in this collective way is new. It's exciting, good on them. And we are really looking forward to the chance to work with them in the year ahead.
Okay, well, before I let you go, where would you suggest that people go for more information on your organization, on this initiative, and any other actions they might take besides calling the representatives about these two rules?
Come visit us at indivisible.org. We have a sort of interim guide that shapes how we're thinking about this period in between the election and the new Congress and inauguration. It's called Showing 2020 the Door. I know we're all ready to be done with this particular year. It's a great place to get a kind of a recap of everything that we just talked about, and we'll be updating it with new calls to action all the time. Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Great to have you, Mary Small, Legislative Director of Indivisible.org. Thanks for your great work, and thanks for coming on the program.